I didn't have time to think. The wooden door trembled as if something heavy were breathing on the other side, and the air slipping through the cracks was already burning my throat. -45°C isn't just cold, it's something alive. It bites. It pulls the heat out of your body like it has hands. I woke with a start to the sound of claws or nails scraping across the packed snow on the step. For a second, I thought it was ice splitting in the gutter. Then it came again, 3 sharp knocks, followed by a long, patient scrape, like something that knew the house was the only light left in a merciless world. I grabbed the flashlight, but my hand trembled before I even touched the metal. It wasn't fear of the dark. It was fear of what the dark had brought to me. I opened the door only as far as the chain would allow, a hand's width, just enough to see and regret it. Outside, the storm swallowed everything. The sky was a white wall, and the wind spun the snow like smoke. But there was a shape cut into that chaos, still, unmoving, far too large to be a wolf. The beam of my flashlight hit striped fur, and my stomach dropped. A tigress, fully grown, her eyes low and watchful. No panic, no rush, the kind of calm that doesn't belong to a starving predator. And that's when I saw the second shape, pressed close against her chest. A cub, small, curled inward, its head drooping as if its neck couldn't hold it up anymore. The tigress nudged the cub forward an inch with her nose, a tiny gesture, a gesture that felt like a request, and the merciless wind pushed through the crack, stealing half the cabin's warmth in a single breath. I knew that if I opened the door any wider, I could lose the cabin. If I shut it, I would lose that. The cub whimpered, very softly. It didn't even sound like an animal. It sounded like life leaking out. I caught myself doing calculations no one should ever have to make. How many seconds can a body that small survive at -45°C without moving? How many minutes before the lungs give up? I had no extra blanket, no cage, no weapon within reach, and even if I had, I wouldn't have been able to lift it, because the tigress wasn't advancing, she was waiting, and in her waiting was a decision that didn't feel like it belonged to me. The cub slipped and fell sideways onto the step. That was all, a small fall. But my body reacted as if someone had dropped a child onto the ice. I unlatched the chain. I opened the door fully for just a second, the length of a sin, and pulled the cub inside with both hands, as if I could steal warmth back from death. If you're watching right now, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. I read many of the comments, and it really helps this video reach more people. When the cub touched the cabin floor, I thought the tigress would follow, but she didn't. She took a step back, then another. She stopped at the edge of the light and stayed there, like a striped shadow holding back the wind. I slammed the door shut and leaned my back against it, holding my breath as if it were glass. The cub trembled in a rhythm that wasn't quite trembling. It was failing. Its tiny paws made short, jerking movements, as if it was still trying to walk outside, but had no fuel left. I dropped to my knees, pulled off my gloves, and regretted it instantly. My skin burned the moment it touched the cub's frozen fur. It wasn't just cold, it was stiff. I dragged the cub closer to the wood stove, opened the small iron door, and fed in to more logs. The fire answered slowly, lazily, as if it too were tired of fighting that winter. And just when I thought I had made the right choice, I heard the other sound. It didn't come from the door. It came from farther out, cutting through the wind like a warning the snow couldn't silence howls. Several of them layered. From every direction, I froze with my hands suspended in the air, my eyes locked on the cub, and a cold certainty settled in my chest. The tigress hadn't brought her cub to me out of gratitude. She had brought him because the whole place was closing in, and something was coming to finish what the cold had started. The howling didn't stop. It split, first to the left of the cabin, then behind the tool shed, then farther out, as if something were tightening an invisible circle in the middle of the storm. I know that sound. It isn't ordinary hunting. It's opportunity. An opportunity in an Alaskan winter means weakness. The cub on the floor gave a short spasm, as if its own body were trying to run without any energy left. I pulled him closer to the stove, took off my heavy coat, and wrapped that small body in wool that still held my warmth. The tigress was outside. I knew it. I felt it, not from the noise but from the silence between the howls. She wasn't answering. She wasn't provoking. She was waiting. The wind slammed against the side of the cabin and the wood cracked. I stood and walked to the side window, lifting the curtain just a centimeter. The sight made me swallow hard. The tigress stood in profile, body low, tail rigid, staring into the darkness beyond my yard. She wasn't looking at the door. She was looking at the shifting white nothing. And there, between gusts of snow, I saw shadows bending the wind. Wolves, at least 4, maybe more. more. They didn't charge straight in. They tested, stepped closer, pulled back, waiting for the cold or exhaustion to do the work for them. That's when I realized the Tigress was alone in that defense, and that inside, I had something she needed kept alive. The cub breathed harder for the first time. It wasn't recovery, it was resistance. I opened my small kerosene refrigerator and took out the only piece of meat I had saved for the week. I cut it into thin strips with shaking hands. I brought one piece close to his muzzle. Nothing. Only after a few seconds did the small tongue move, almost automatic. A reflex. I supported his head carefully and tried again. Slowly, he'd swallowed a tiny piece, then another. Outside, a deep growl sliced through the wind. Not an attack, a warning. The Tigress was claiming territory that wasn't hers. She was using my cabin as a boundary line, and I began to understand, if the wolves decided to test the wood, she wouldn't be able to defend two sides at once. That's when the light flickered. Not the ceiling, I don't have grid power. The auxiliary generator that feeds the small emergency heater. A dry snap came from the back of the house, then silence. The kind of silence heavier than noise. I stood still for 2 seconds that felt like an entire minute. If the generator had died, the stove alone wouldn't hold minus 45 degrees Celsius for long, and going out to check meant opening the door. Again, it meant breaking the fragile agreement that existed there. I looked at the cub, looked at the window. The Tigress was still there, unmoving, like a statue carved from muscle and snow. She wasn't asking to come in. She was giving me time. I took the rifle from the wall, not to shoot her, to cross the yard. I wrapped a scarf over my face, pulled my beanie down to my eyebrows, and stopped in front of the door. My hand touched the handle, and I felt a strange weight in my chest. It wasn't fear of dying. It was the sense that if I stepped outside, something there would change forever. I opened it. The wind hit me like a wall. The Tigress turned her head toward me but didn't growl. She simply shifted half a step aside, opening an invisible corridor toward the generator, as if she knew exactly where I needed to go. And in that instant, I realized something even worse than the wolves. The tracks in the snow weren't only theirs. There were deeper marks, wider spaced, coming from the forest. Something bigger had passed through before the storm thickened. The tracks weren't fresh, but they weren't old enough to reassure me either. They were wide, deep, spaced too far apart to belong to a wolf. I crouched down despite the wind slicing across my face and ran my hand inside one of the impressions. The snow hadn't fully hardened yet. Whatever had passed through had done so before the storm worsened. An adult moose, maybe, but moose don't circle cabins like that. And the way the tracks came from the tree line, curved wide and disappeared behind my shed. That wasn't the movement of something fleeing. It was inspection. The generator was covered in a thin layer of ice. I pulled the metal lid and felt the snap of frozen steel. The fuel was still there. The problem was the hose, stiff as glass. I had to use both hands to loosen the connection. As I did, I heard the first crack from the side of the house. It wasn't wind. It was wood under pressure. I looked up just in time to see two low shadows moving at the edge of my vision. Wolves. They were testing the structure. They weren't attacking the Tigress directly. They were looking for another way in. The Tigress reacted before I did. She didn't roar. She moved in silence, body pressed to the ground, and intercepted with an explosion of speed. I had seen only once before in my life, decades ago, out in open country. One wolf retreated instantly. The other hesitated half a second too long. The impact was sharp, a collision of bodies in the snow, and then nothing but white chaos. I didn't see blood. I only saw the wolf limp away, vanishing into the storm. The message had been delivered, but I understood what it meant. She was burning energy she couldn't afford to lose. The generator kicked back to life with a choking jolt. The vibration ran through my hands like a pulse, returning. The cabin lights flickered again in the distance. I should have felt relief, but when I turned to go back, something stopped me in place. The Tigress didn't return to the door right away. She stood in the middle of the yard, panting, staring at the tree line, and then I saw it too. Between the trunks, still, too tall to be a wolf, too solid to be a shadow, a bear, likely drawn by the scent of meat, by movement, by chaos. Winter makes them unpredictable, and a hungry bear doesn't negotiate. I couldn't stay outside, and I couldn't leave her alone against that. But I was a man over 70, holding an old rifle in a minus 45 degrees Celsius storm. The bear took one step forward, slow, heavy. The snow sank beneath its weight, as if the ground were giving way. The Tigress shifted her stance. She didn't attack. She didn't retreat. She positioned herself exactly between the bear and my door. She wasn't defending territory, she was defending direction. And in that moment, something locked into place inside me with a clarity that cold couldn't freeze. She hadn't brought the cub there just for warmth. She had chosen the only point in the forest, with a wall, with fire, and with someone who had stood between her and danger before. The bear took another step forward, slow, calculated. It wasn't a charge, it was a test. He lifted his snout and drew in the air, catching the scent of meat, of the cub of fear. The rifle felt heavier in my hands, not because of the weapon itself, but because of what using it would mean. A shot out there wouldn't solve anything. It would only escalate it. And if I missed, if I only wounded him, the chaos would come straight to my cabin door. The tigress kept her body low, shoulders tight, tail still. She wasn't in an attack stance. She was in a delaying stance. She didn't need to defeat the bear. She only needed to buy time. The wind shifted direction. It came sideways, throwing snow into the bear's eyes. He blinked, irritated, shook his heavy head. The tigress seized that second and advanced to short, firm steps, marking a boundary. There was no roar, only presence. I realized then that the bear wasn't hungry enough to fight to the end. He was calculating cost, and the storm was increasing that cost with every minute. Another step, another pause. The silence among the three of us was louder than any sound. Then the bear did what experienced predators do when the numbers don't add up. He slowly turned his body and retreated toward the tree line. He didn't run. He didn't show weakness. He simply vanished among the white trunks. I didn't wait to see if he would change his mind. I ran back to the door, feeling the air tear through my lungs. I went inside, shut it, locked it, pushed a light cabinet against the wood out of reflex. My hands were numb when I knelt beside the cub. His breathing was steadier, still weak, but rhythmic. I placed 2 fingers against his small chest and felt the heart, too fast, but fighting. For the first time since I opened the door, I thought he might survive the night. Outside, I heard the tigress returning to her post. She didn't scratch, she didn't ask to come in. She simply resumed her vigil. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the tigress's right forepaw, as she passed in front of the window, there was a curved scar, pale against the dark fur. It wasn't recent, it was old, and I knew that shape. Years ago, in an operation near the frozen strait that separates Alaska from Russia, I had taken part in the rescue of a young tigress caught in an illegal trap. Her paw had been crushed by metal. I was the one who held her head. While the veterinarian worked, I was the one who spoke softly until her breathing slowed. When she woke from sedation, she tried to stand, and fell. I was there when she managed to bear weight for the first time. I moved closer to the window slowly, my heart beating differently now. The tigress turned her face toward me, and for a second too long to be coincidence, she held my gaze. It wasn't challenge, it wasn't threat, it was restrained recognition, as if some old memory had pushed through the cold and found the same scent, the same posture, the same voice that once hadn't harmed her. She stepped toward the door, pressed her nose against the wood, not to enter, but exactly where I stood on the other side. And in that silent gesture, I understood. She hadn't come only for shelter. She had come to me. She kept her nose against the door for a few seconds. I slowly raised my hand and touched the wood on my side, exactly where I knew the warmth of her breath was on the other. The thickness of the door was the only thing between us, but it wasn't a barrier. It was a boundary, and there was something almost solemn in that shared silence. Outside, the storm still roared. Inside, the cub breathed with difficulty, but he breathed. I spoke, softly, not to calm her, so she would know I was still there. The same voice she had once heard while metal was being removed from her paw. The cub stirred, a stronger movement. His head tried to lift, fell, tried again. I supported him gently and offered another small piece of meat, now moistened with warm water. He managed to swallow without me having to force it. Small victories, almost invisible, but enough to change the course of an entire night. Outside, the tigress stepped away from the door and circled the cabin, checking the perimeter. Not like a predator stalking prey, like a mother making sure the walls were still standing. And then the cold found another way to attack. The wind surged suddenly, making the chimney vibrate. The stove flame wavered dangerously. If the fire went out, the heat would drop too fast. I stood to reinforce the logs when I heard a sharp crack from the roof. ice breaking loose. Part of the side covering gave way under the weight of snow. It wasn't a full collapse, but enough to open a gap where cutting air began to seep inside. I felt the change immediately. The warmth began to escape. I couldn't fix that from outside. It would be suicide in that wind. So I did the only possible thing. I improvised. From within, I dragged the table, stacked blankets against the affected wall, used old boards to reinforce the inside. As I worked, I thought about what would happen if the structure gave way completely. The cub wouldn't survive another exposure to the cold, and maybe neither would I. That was when I heard something unexpected, a sound different from the wind, a dull impact against the side of the cabin. I went to the side window and saw it. The Tigress was positioned exactly against the damaged side of the house, her body pressed to the wall, blocking part of the wind with her own weight. She understood. Instinctively, she couldn't come inside to share the warmth, so she offered her body as a barrier. Snow piled across her back, but she didn't move. Something tightened in my chest that had no simple name. It wasn't just gratitude, it was reciprocity. Years ago, I had stood between her and iron. Now, she stood between me and winter. I went back to the cub and sat beside him. His breathing was steadier. His eyes opened halfway for a second. They didn't focus on me, but they were alive. I rested my hand lightly on his small chest and spoke softly again, not to teach trust, but to keep an invisible thread connected between the three of us. The night wasn't over yet. The wolves could return. The bear could reconsider. The cabin could give way. But in that sliver of time stolen from the cold, there was no man against animal. There were three survivors holding the same thin line against the world outside. Dawn took its time. Every minute felt forced forward, as if time itself were freezing. The wind began to lose strength just before sunrise. Not total silence, but less violence. The cabin still groaned, but it held. I was sitting on the floor, leaning against the reinforced wall, when I realized the cub was no longer trembling. His small body was simply warm now, not strong, but warm. I placed 2 fingers against his neck again. The heart still raced, but it wasn't frantic anymore. It was life trying to return to its own rhythm. Outside, the Tigress hadn't left her position when the grey light of morning began dissolving the absolute white of the storm. I stepped closer to the window. She was there, snow covering her back, but standing, vigilant, exhausted. The wolves hadn't returned. The bear had left no new tracks. The forest seemed suspended, as if it too were waiting for the outcome. I drew a deep breath and knew the moment had come. That night couldn't repeat itself. I didn't have food for days, nor the structure to keep a wild cub alive inside. I opened the door slowly. The air still cut, but it no longer killed in the first second. The Tigress turned her head immediately, but didn't advance. I knelt at the threshold and placed the cub, wrapped in my thick coat, right at the entrance. He blinked under the cold morning light, too small to understand what had happened, too big to belong to that cabin. The Tigress approached in slow, measured steps. She stopped less than a meter from me, both of us still. She touched the cub with her nose, a firm touch, almost clinical, then softer. The little one answered with a weak but living sound. The Tigress lifted her eyes to me. There was no threat there, no submission. There was something I can only call complete recognition. I spoke the name I had never given her, but had always carried silently for years. It didn't matter if she understood the word. She understood the tone. And in that gaze, I felt the same moment from years ago, when her paw trembled after surgery, and I was there holding her head until the pain eased. She picked up the cub carefully. No rush, no flight. She turned toward the forest and walked a few meters. Then she stopped, looked back. One last time, not to confirm safety, to close something invisible between us. And she disappeared among the trees, carrying with her the small body that now had another chance. I stood there until the tracks were nothing more than soft impressions in the snow. Days later, I found new tracks at dawn. They came from the forest, stopped in front of my door, and turned back. No scratches, no request, just the clear mark that she had passed there again, not out of need, but out of memory. And I understood that some connections don't require constant proximity. They only need one true moment under extreme pressure to exist forever. I thought it had all ended when the tracks faded into the tree line. But the truth is, some nights don't end when the sun rises. They stay, in your bones, in your memory, in the way you breathe afterward. For weeks, every time the wind touched the door, my body reacted before my mind did. I would rise slowly from the chair, walk to the window, and expect to see stripes against the white. Sometimes there was nothing. Sometimes only old marks nearly erased by new snow. But inside me, something had changed forever. I returned to the simple routine of the cabin. Firewood, melted water, roof repairs, silence. But it wasn't the same silence. I began noticing details that had once escaped me. The direction of moose tracks, the rhythm of ravens, the way the wind shifts before a snowfall. I was more attentive, not out of fear, out of respect. Because that night I understood something it took me a lifetime to learn. Surviving isn't about dominating the environment. It's about recognizing when you are part of it. Sometimes people ask why didn't try to keep the cub. The answer is simple. He wasn't mine to save. I was only the bridge. The tigress didn't bring her cub for me to raise him. She brought him because she knew that, for one night, I would stand between him and what wanted to kill him. Just as one day I stood between her and the iron of a trap. It wasn't heroism, it was continuity, a silent cycle of protection that doesn't depend on species. Months later, on a clear morning, I saw something in the distance. On top of the frozen hill, a larger shape beside the tigress. The cub was no longer small. He walked firmly, matching his mother's pace. They didn't come closer, they didn't need to. The tigress stopped for a second, turned her face toward my cabin, and continued on. I didn't feel loss. I felt completion. Some stories don't need a dramatic reunion. They only need confirmation that the choice made under pressure was worth it. If this story touched you in any way, I want to know. Leave in the comments which city and country you're watching from. I read many of them, and it's incredible to see how far these stories travel. Like the video if you believe respect and memory also exist in nature. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey. Because in extreme places, between humans and animals, there's always another story waiting to be lived.